So without further ado, we're going to move on to talk about what happened this morning. I'm going to hand over to Tim Bowmer, the chair of the RAC, who will tell you in his own words what happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the Committee for Risk Assessment, the RAC, has indeed finalised its opinion on the classification and labelling of glyphosate. It developed this opinion after carrying out an extensive evaluation of all the information that was available for this substance. RAC agreed with the German dossier submitter that glyphosate should not be classified as a carcinogen, that is, as a substance causing cancer. This conclusion was based both on the human evidence and the weight of the evidence of all the animal studies reviewed. In addition, RAC concluded that glyphosate does not warrant classification as a mutagen, that is, a substance causing genetic effects, or as a substance causing reproductive effects. Glyphosate already has an entry in Annex 6 of the Classification, Labelling and Packaging Regulation, where it currently has some classifications, and these will be retained. Finally, I would like to say the committee's opinion was adopted by consensus today, that is, with the full support of all the members, and there were no minority positions.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was clear. We have questions coming in straight away. I'd like to mention that the press release is now also live on our website so that you can have a look at that as well. The first question coming in then is from Politico. And the question I think is probably for Ari to answer. It's about methodology. How does your methodology to define hazard differ from the one used by IARC?
The methodology to determine hazard for cancer, for something that causes cancer, is quite similar, actually, in terms of terminology. If I'm understanding the question correctly, we use the same terminology. There's sufficient evidence and limited evidence for carcinogenicity. It's just that we have different criteria. We talk about substances that are known human carcinogens, presumed human carcinogens, and substances that are suspected of causing cancer to humans. Of course, if it doesn't meet any of those criteria, then a substance is not classified at all for carcinogenicity.
Okay, and that's what's happened today.
That's right.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just whipping back to some more questions. I think this is also actually for you, Ari. It's about the studies that have been taken into account. So which studies did ECHA take into account? Does it include the International Agency for Research on Cancer, so IARC? Does it include the studies they took into account?
In fact, the studies which ECHA or RAC took into account in its assessment were from wider than what IARC used. We took the same studies into account in mice and rats, but also assessed a number of other studies in addition to those in mice and rats.
Okay, thank you. So here's a further question about stakeholder engagement in this decision-making process. So probably for you, Tim, okay, as it's about the committee. So can you tell how stakeholders have been engaged in this process and what input they have had?
Certainly. We held a public consultation on this dossier quite a long while back. It's open for 6 weeks. And then public has the chance to provide any comments they choose to of a scientific nature on the dossier. Those comments are then collated and the dossier submitter responds to them in writing. And then finally, as will happen when the documents are published, the rapporteurs actually respond to both sets of comments. So everything that's come in through the public consultation will be looked at and addressed. But I think you probably mean during the actual debates. We started this discussion at RAC 39 last December, and we invited 6 interested parties to present to the full committee. And that included a cross-section of civil society, representatives of industry, obviously, but also IARC and the WHO, FAO joint monitoring program, another UN body with an opinion on glyphosate. So we have attempted at all phases to involve stakeholders actively in this, within reason. The committee has to come to its own decision in the end.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I think this one's for you, actually, Jack. It's a question from Farmers Weekly, and they're obviously interested in understanding what happens from now on until the end of the year with regards to the licensing of glyphosate.
Yes, I can answer that. Thank you very much. What happens now is that we finalize the opinion, basically. So after the, let's say, formal opinion making which took place this morning, there will be further editing of the text, and once that text is available, we formally submit it to the European Commission in Brussels, and they take that opinion further in the final decision making on whether to continue the approval of the use of glyphosate as an active substance in pesticidal products. So it's not a direct impact which this opinion has, but it's up to the Commission now to take this forward into their final decision making.
Okay, thanks. And a related question actually from Bloomberg is, are you saying there are no concerns about glyphosate? Would you therefore expect the Commission to reauthorize for long-term use, or are there caveats?
I think if I can take that one, maybe my colleagues want to add that. I think from the classification point of view, it's clear that indeed, let's say the major endpoints which have been under debate, which is the carcinogenicity, mutagenicity and toxicity for reproduction, there is a very clear conclusion from the committee that the substance should not be classified accordingly. And therefore I think that will be a major input into the decision making done by the Commission. Are there uncertainties? Yes, there are always uncertainties, and these have been addressed very carefully by the committee and also will be described in the opinion. But their overall final conclusion was that there's no classification needed, and that is an important element which the Commission will take forward.
Thank you. Another question on a different perspective. I suspect it's also for you, Jack, but I'm not sure. From New Zürcher Zeitung, my German is appalling, I apologize. Do you only rate the risk potential of glyphosate? Has the exposure of people been taken into account at all?
Not in our opinion making. So we have, as ECHA, a very specific task. We indeed are requested to look at the hazard. So whether the substance has the potency to actually cause, let's say, cancer, whether it's the ability to cause cancer. And there the conclusion has been from the REC committee that it does not fulfill the criteria for calling it a carcinogen. The actual risks we have not been looking at. This is not in our remit. This is what EFSA has been doing in the past already. And of course, the Commission will now look at the EFSA conclusions from the past and further work which they are doing, combining that with our conclusion from the REC, and take its position in terms of the further approval of the active substance glyphosate. Okay,
thank you. And a related question also, I'm afraid, for you, Jack, we're working you hard today.
No problem.
Did the committee and is ECHA taking into account a kind of precautionary approach in reaching this opinion?
A precautionary approach, I don't think we should call it that way. What the committee does, like with any scientific evaluation, is look at all the uncertainties. And I think what my colleague can maybe add more to that. In the case of glyphosate, there is a very substantial amount of information, and not every piece of information is very easy to explain, to interpret. So there's been a lot of debate in the development of the opinion how to interpret certain pieces of information, in particular on the carcinogenicity studies for this substance, which is of course why we're having this debate at all. And what the committee does is look at the uncertainties, describe them, assess them, and then overall take a weight of evidence approach, look at all the information together from the animal studies and the human studies, and come to a conclusion. That is not so much a sort of application of a precautionary approach or precautionary principle. It basically assesses the information and describes the information from a scientific point of view.
Okay, thank you. Actually, there's a related question which I think is coming your way, Ari, and it's about the weighing up of evidence in animal studies. I'm paraphrasing because the English isn't great in the question. And it's about how can a judgment of non-carcinogenicity be made when in animal studies animals have died of cancer? How can that judgment be made?
Okay, yes. Thank you for the question. There have indeed in the animal studies been indications of cancers. There have been, in the rats, there were 2 or 3 types of cancer seen, and in the mice there was 3 types of cancer seen. These were slightly above background. However, when you look at the total picture, you need to take into account that in these studies, the actual incidences of these tumours, these cancers in these studies, were only slightly above background. They were only seen in one sex in any studies, so in males, not in females. They were not seen consistently in the species, so in mice there were studies in which there were no cancers seen at all, or none of these cancers seen at all, and in any case these cancers were seen in different studies in many cases. And then there was very little evidence in rats in any case of any cancers. They were seen in 2 out of the 7 studies that were looked at in detail. So taking the overall picture into account, the conclusion was that there is not enough evidence to indicate that it should be classified for cancer or carcinogenicity.
Okay, thank you. Question back for you, Jack. I'm sure ECHA, this is from Bloomberg, I'm sure ECHA is aware that there will be criticism of this decision, accusations of bias, conflicts of interest, etc. How do you respond to that? How can you show clearly that a decision has been taken without bending to lobbying influence?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I would first of all maybe say that we take this discussion on conflict of interest very serious. And we've always taken it very serious. We have a very clear and transparent policy, how we deal with conflict of interest, which is based on international guidelines and also has been discussed with our management board and approved by our management board. And we are very stringent in implementing that policy in practice. And that means, for instance, that we carefully check our staff, the members of our committees, as well as all collaborators we work with in developing these scientific opinions, that there are no conflict of interest. And in case of glyphosate, we of course have done that. And we are very confident that indeed we have no issue at all in terms of the transparency and let's say independence of this opinion, which has been made by the risk assessment committee. So we're very confident that we are clear in that sense.
Okay, and you don't imagine, just following on from that same question, you don't imagine further measures that need to be taken to, as the questioner was asking, to ensure or to show that no lobbying has had an effect on this decision?
I don't think we need to take further measures. We have, of course, made sure that no lobbying has taken place. And I think Tim already referred earlier to the, let's say, the way stakeholders, including industry stakeholders, have been involved in the process. But we are very confident that no specific lobbying has taken place towards the committee members. That has been checked, that has been regularly requested to them, and we have no signs at all that has taken place. We are, of course, aware of the concerns which have been provided, and we've also answered to some of the letters which have been we have received. And if people are interested in our answers, they can find them all on our website if you want to have a more detailed look at it.
Yes, and just for anyone who can't find them on the website, because there's a lot of stuff on our website, there's an actual web section on glyphosate in 23 languages, so you can read up about what's been happening on there. Further question, I think this one's for Tim. Is this classification going to be re-evaluated, and if so, after what period of time?
It's not subject to any fixed review period. The recommendation will go to the Commission fairly shortly, and it would be included in an adaptation to progress, so go into legislation probably next year, we expect. But it's not subject to a review period. There could be reason to review it if something new were to come to light which hasn't been considered, if other studies suddenly appear or had been planned which we're not aware of, but that seems unlikely at the moment. But it would take quite a large shift in the evidence, I think, to warrant reopening fairly soon.
And thank you. And just to follow up to that question, how does such a review get triggered? Who can trigger it?
It would be by a member state submitting another dossier, just like Germany did for this one.
Okay.
Through the same procedure.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jack, there's a European Citizens Initiative petition being carried out at the moment on glyphosate, which will run for a year. Has this been taken into account in the ECHA decision? And isn't the ECHA decision a bit premature before the petition ends?
We are aware of that citizen initiative, but it has not played a specific impact on the task which we have. And as I think I mentioned before, we are specifically looking here at the hazard properties of glyphosate, and the committee has given its scientific opinion on that. What to do in terms of the overall use of glyphosate and whether to continue, let's say, its use as a pesticide or product is not part of the remit of ECHA to decide upon. So that is definitely a discussion which will have to take place in Brussels, which the Commission will have to look at, and I'm sure they will also, let's say, take into account the citizens' initiative.
Okay, thank you. Probably this question's for both of you. How do you explain that IARC found sufficient evidence and RAC did not for carcinogenicity, particularly in animals, obviously?
I guess one starting point is that we're looking at a different data set. They looked also at studies in which they used IARC. I'm talking about IARC. Looked at also at studies in which they used the formulation. We look at the pure chemical fairly strictly, and then besides that, there is a different body of people within a different framework, operating within a different framework. Perhaps Tim would like to add.
Yeah, maybe it's useful to add something about the makeup of the RAC committee. The members are drawn from all across the European Union and the European Economic Area countries. We currently have members from 26 or 27 different member states and EEA members. They're nominated by their member states, but they're appointed by the management board of ECHA in their personal capacity. So they're from really widely across the whole European Union, and they do act as individual scientists, so in their personal capacity, not on behalf of their member states. So we think that that because of that construction, which is part of the REACH regulation, that they have an independent opinion to give, and I think that's what they've done today. I think IARC's committees are constituted differently, so that could be one of the factors behind it.
Okay. And another question, I think probably for Jack, is about the use of products containing glyphosate and the fact that in some countries, effectively, they're banned. So what do we read into that? And supplementary question is, do you use glyphosate?
Well, the last one is easy. I don't use glyphosate. So that's I've done a lot of weeding last year with my hands. So I would not advise it to everybody, but that's a different story. On the first one, yes, this is again, I think, a very important question. But of course, it's a national decision which is falling under the pesticides regulation. So what happens? I think it's good for people to understand indeed that at an EU level, the decision is made whether to accept or not accept the use of an active substance in a pesticidal product. But the actual product, once it's placed on the market, and whether to accept that or not, is done at the national level. So it is indeed for the different member states, even after the potential reapproval or by the Commission of glyphosate, whether then still to allow the use of that substance in products on their markets. And we as ECHA have no involvement in that story.
Okay, thank you. We're coming back to the apparent discrepancy between IARC's opinion and RAC's. How has ECHA weighed the human studies showing an increased incidence of non-Hodgkin lymphoma among farm workers, which was important evidence for IARC?
I can start. I have to admit that I'm not an epidemiologist. That's the first thing. However, those people with epidemiological expertise have indicated that perhaps the most powerful study among the epidemiology studies for this substance has been this cohort study. And the evidence from that apparently was very weak for association. In addition, there were some indications apparently in the case control studies. However, these indications were also quite weak. Tim, would you like to say anything?
I think the committee found problems with a lot of the epidemiology studies in their design and in their execution. I think the farm study, which was the most robust, according to the members, depending on how it's analysed statistically, showed either no effect or a very slight effect. And I think in the weight of evidence, that's what the members responded to in their decision.
Okay. Could I come back to you? Particularly you, Ari, you mentioned two technical terms, a cohort study and another one whose name I've forgotten. Can you just explain to us what those two different kinds of studies mean?
I don't have the epidemiological expertise to actually explain those in detail.
Okay. Do you, Tim, by any chance?
No, I'm afraid I have
okay.
the same hindrance.
So if any of our listeners are interested in the answer to that, please ask the question again and we'll get back to you this afternoon. Further question, did the ECHA decision also, I think this is for Tim, also take into account recent tests on European parliamentary members which showed up traces of glyphosate in their systems?
I think the honest answer to that is I don't know. And I can't say really whether it's relevant or not relevant to the case.
The question, just to be clear, the question wasn't was it relevant, but the question was, did you take it into account, the fact that members of parliament had glyphosate in their systems, apparently, according to the question?
I wasn't aware of this issue.
No.
I could add that this goes into the area of risk assessment. We're looking just at the hazardous properties of glyphosate, and that's a slightly different ballgame.
Okay.
I think if I may add to that, it's an important point which Ari explains here, that indeed as part of the overall risk assessment which EFSA carries out and has carried out, they indeed look at concentrations which are found in human bodies, in tissues, and potentially compare that with the no effect levels, so the levels at which we see no effects, which are relevant for humans. And that's the risk assessment question which EFSA tries to answer. But this is not an issue which we've been looking at. So these exposure information, these data we have not taken into account because they play no role in our process.
Okay, thank you. And one final question, unless anyone has any back at home, this will be the last question, and it's about procedure. So I'll ask you, Tim, has this procedure for glyphosate followed the normal pattern for the work in your committee?
Yes, I'm pretty certain that it has. The process is quite interactive. We take views from a wide variety of sources, from industry, from civil society representatives. We followed the procedure in the usual way with a full public consultation that will be fully taken into account and responded to. Our discussions have been open to accredited stakeholders who have been free to intervene in committee in as far as time allows, bearing in mind that it's ultimately the members who have to come to a decision, not the stakeholders. But we've followed the procedure for this dossier as we would with any other, bearing in mind that this is about our 250th decision on classification and labelling alone.
Okay, well that's actually a nice way to round it up. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good afternoon.